I hope you guys are having a good Wednesday. Today, our learning objective, what we're going to be talking about is the growth of urban areas in comparison to the rural areas that we typically see in early America. Okay, so before we jump into anything, we need to make sure we understand and we're really familiar with some key terms. When we talk about rural areas, we're talking about a countryside or a geographic region that is not very densely populated, which essentially means there's not too many people living in tight proximity to one another. The towns are much more spread out, the cities are much more spread out. There's a lot of open fields and things like that where they're able to work on agriculture and things like that. We see this happen in a lot of early towns. We also see it happen a lot more in the South because if you remember, the southern colonies are rich in good soil and they relied largely on agriculture. So we see a lot more rural areas there. When we jump to urban, we see urban cities, cities like Philadelphia, cities like Boston, where there's a lot happening. There's a bunch of people living in a relatively tight area. This is what we think of when we think of cities, when we think of New York, when we think of downtown San Antonio. We don't see a whole lot of green. We see a lot more concrete. Some people call them concrete jungles. And that's exactly kind of what they are. There's a lot of people living on top of each other. Back in the 1800s, there wasn't very good plumbing. There wasn't very good city services. So oftentimes we see it's very dirty. People are throwing their bathroom materials, quote unquote, out the window because there's no running water and so on and so forth. Everyone's living on top of each other. The resources are a little bit more scarce because there's just not enough of them to go around for the amount of people living in that designated area. Okay, so urban and rural, those are the two terms we're going to kind of be focusing on, and why certain cities are urban or more urban centers and others are more rural centers. So let's review real quick. When we talk about the South, right? Southern industry versus northern industry. We're talking about the South. What does the South rely on to make money? Okay, how did the South make their money? We should be able to identify that. Then we look at the North, and when we look at the North, what does the North rely on to make money? What were some of the things that we saw in the New England colonies? What did they do? What was their industry like? All right, so in review, we talk about northern industry, and the North heavily relied on manufacturing, and they used the raw materials that they would get from, well, when we look at the New England colonies, right, they would chop down the trees and they would use the wood, use the lumber to construct things, furniture, ships, and things like that. They would also use ports to go fishing and things like that. They didn't really rely on planting and agriculture too much. They would use actually cotton that was harvested in the South. It was sent up to the North, and it was processed in these plantations, which are these factory-looking things where they were made into cloth using textile mills. And what we see happen over time when we talk about urbanization, what we see happen is these factories lead to urban cities in the North, big urban cities in the North. When we look at the South, however, it's kind of like the opposite. It's the mirror image. The South relied on the agricultural society. They relied on farming. They relied on the plantation system of labor. They used slave labor to harvest cotton that was going to be sent up north to be used in the textile mills. They were also trading with foreign countries, tobacco, rice, all sorts of different cash crops. This, because of the reliance on agriculture, we see that there's a lot more rural areas in the South because they need land. You can't farm if you don't have land. So we don't see big cities popping up. We see smaller towns. They're spread out more throughout the South. And that's not by coincidence. That's very much by design because that was how the South made their money. That was their industry. When you look at this picture, What do you think? Where do you think you would find this, rather? Do you think you would find this in an urban city or in a rural town? This contributes to the rise of urbanization. What is one thing you see when you look at this map? Sorry. One thing you see when you look at this map is you see more and you see larger cities in the north than what you would see in the south. Okay? I want you to type in the next little part here. What is this a result of? This is probably a result of what? All right, so when we take a look at this map here, we see almost a pretty clear dividing line. Above where my cursor is right here, you see a lot more dots and you see a lot more larger cities, right? This is where Chicago is, this is where Boston is, so on and so forth. And you see more population in a tighter area up in the north as opposed to down in the south. And then the west is just kind of getting its foot, right? So we don't see too much happening in the west by way of population, but we see a lot more in the eastern part of the United States and much more in the northeastern part of the United States. One of the reasons for this is if you go back to this picture here, you see there's a lot of people required to run a factory like this. So one of the things that we see in these urban cities is factories. Well, factories need workers. Now, if you were working in a factory and you had a choice to live down the street in an urban city or an hour away, and remember, they don't have cars. They don't have cars back then. They had to rely on other means of transportation. Would you rather spend an hour trying to get to work, or would you rather just walk down the street, clock in, do your time, clock out, go home, see your family? And that's a question that a lot of people had to ask themselves. And so we see a lot of people kind of abandon the rural way of life and move into these urban city centers because that's where the jobs were. That's where the jobs were. And we see it now. You don't see very big, very big uh, company headquarters in the middle of nowhere. You just don't see it very often. So that precedent was kind of established at this time during the rise of urbanization as a result of the Industrial Revolution.